Okay, back again, talking about Letter from a Birmingham Jail and how Dr. King addresses the other side in his argument. Um, if we look at the first page of the letter and if you read the background info, you know that he's addressing 8 white religious leaders who had basically condemned the nonviolent actions of Martin Luther King Jr. and his organization that were having some nonviolent protests. So, as he addresses his opposition, he basically knocks down each of their claims. Again, that's kind of how he's structured his argument, by taking a claim that they made and showing his side. But he also addresses the audience, or the other side, with kindness. You know, he doesn't just completely bash their ideas. He wants them to see his side. And you see that even just from the first paragraph, as he tells us his purpose is to respond to this letter that they had basically published condemning these acts. And he says, you know, the last sentence of that paragraph, he says, "But since I feel that you are men of genuine goodwill and your criticisms are sincerely set forth, I would like to answer your statement in what I hope will be patient and reasonable terms." And as you read the letter, I think we can sense a little bit of tension in King's tone. But all in all, I think for the circumstances, he keeps his tone very polite and very controlled, because he doesn't want to alienate the other side. He wants them to see his side. And that's really important in our own arguments. We don't want to alienate the other side, because who are you arguing to if you don't have someone who disagrees with you? You want the people that disagree with you to listen to your side. And so sometimes we make an error in kind of offending our opposition right off the bat. And I don't know about you, but if someone offends me, I'm less likely to read their whole argument, and I'm way less likely to listen to them and try to understand their side. So we want to address the opposition with honesty and dignity. And I think King is a good example of that. Another thing to think about just with the way he gives support, think about the types of examples he gives, and then think about his audience. Why does he choose to use so many biblical examples, for example? Obviously, his audience are ministers, and so it makes sense that he would use biblical examples, because those have authority with his audience. Whereas, you know, if he was addressing a secular audience, he may not want to use so many biblical references, because not everyone believes the Bible. And so he uses evidence and support to convince his audience. And that's something you want to think about in your own arguments. So he uses a lot of biblical support, again, in catering to his audience. He addresses the other side quite frequently as he addresses different claims that they've made and refutes those claims. He avoids logical fallacies when possible. He doesn't use extreme language, although I do feel like occasionally he may fall into a little bit of an extreme language. Honestly, I think it's because of the subject matter. Obviously, we're not fighting for freedom here and desegregation, and I think Dr. King, of course, had a very heavy task ahead of him. And so I wanted to show you just one example of maybe Dr. King falling into the trap of a logical fallacy. On page, let's see, on page 4, paragraph 24, so the second to last on the page 4, he is discussing extremists, which I love this paragraph anyway. It's a really great logical argument. He goes into what are we if we're not extremists for love. He says we're extremists for hate. And this is kind of an either-or fallacy. He's setting up a very complicated situation and saying, well, if you're not for love, you're for hate. And it kind of ignores the fact that there could be anything else in between. And he does this to persuade his audience. He does this to back up what he's already said. But in all actuality, that could be a little bit of a weakness in his argument, because he doesn't seem to leave any room for any gray area. Again, I feel like with the time period and the subject matter that he's writing for, he kind of has to be that way. But I did want to show you just in real life some fallacies that we could fall under. So hopefully that is a good example there. Rhetorical appeals, I think King uses all three of these. Ethos, he builds a very ethical argument. He gives great support to build his credibility. He mentions that he himself is a minister. He's grown up in the church. That gives him great credibility with his audience. He gives careful and logical explanation and organization, which leads to his credibility. Pathos, I mentioned earlier, he does give some emotional examples. The examples of him with his daughter and son, some of the examples of the cruelty put on African Americans, I think are examples of, that's not a logical example, but it is an emotional one. It's one that we feel sympathy and we feel rage perhaps when he gives us those examples. So it's a good example of pathos. Logos, obviously, one of the reasons I'm showing you this argument is how logical it is. Because remember, your argument, it is an argument paper. It's not a research paper. And so I like how King uses different types of evidence. He doesn't just use statistics or facts to try to prove his point. That's not what he needs. He needs to show logic to his audience so that they'll understand his argument. And so, again, this is basically one huge logical argument, but I thought I'd give you just an interesting example of one type of logical chain he makes that I really like. On the bottom of page 3, page 3, in paragraph 20, he tells us that his opposition is opposing them because they precipitate violence. That topic sentence says, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But can this assertion be logically made? Isn't this like condemning the robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't it like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to the truth and his philosophical delvings precipitated the misguided popular mind to make him drink the hemlock? Isn't it like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to his will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? No, so he's logically bringing up these examples of the illogical claim that these nonviolent protests precipitate violence. So it's a really interesting logical appeal, and he does this throughout with basically every example he gives is a logical example, except for a few emotional. So I hope that this small discussion of the letter from the Birmingham jail will motivate you to study this letter a little bit more and really delve into the parts of the argument in King's letter. Look for claims, look for support, look for how he uses logic. I think it's a great argument to study. Of course, I kind of added this because I know you're studying a lot in your book as well, and I think those examples are great as well for helping you see examples of argument in real life and in student writing. One example of that would be on page 311 in your book, the sample position paper that you read, I believe last week, Nuclear is Not the Answer. Again, I just wanted to point out one of many great examples of argument and how your argument paper might be structured and might look. Okay, so you have a thesis and an outline due Wednesday. You may want to go back and look at page 295 for your outline and look at the examples on 295 of some different ways you might outline your argument. Right now, hopefully you have an idea of the claim you want to make. Hopefully you have an idea of some main points, and now you can just kind of wrap those all up together. Don't forget your rough draft is due Sunday. I will get you feedback on your thesis and outline as soon as you turn those in. That assignment is up in our week 11 folder. Hopefully that'll help give you some direction. I also did want to pop up the assignment sheet really quickly in this video and just remind you of some of the details of this assignment. One thing is that on Wednesday, I want you to give me these three things: thesis statement, essay map, outline. So all that means is give me your main points in a sentence. That's all that an essay map means. Your thesis statement might actually have an essay map in it. I'm just wanting to know your main points. And then of course I'll know your main points from your outline as well. Hopefully you've started working on a list of quotes based on your reading of some of this material or your own reading on these topics. And then of course you'll turn in the rough draft this Sunday. And so by 11, and this is when we'll start peer review on Sunday, you'll be able to peer review your peers' arguments, and we're going to do quite an extensive peer review on this argument to really hopefully help us all improve our arguments more and more towards the due date. It's not due until Sunday, November 23rd, so we've still got a couple of weeks to work on this and perfect it. So I'm excited to see where this all goes. I'm excited to see where you're taking it by looking at your outlines and thesis statements. Remember, again, if you hear anything in these videos, I want you to hear that this is an argument paper, not a research paper. So use the sources that I've given you. You may want to do a little bit of research, and that's fine. But remember, just like King, I don't want you to be using other people's arguments. I want you to be using logical examples to help prove your point. Using metaphors, using historical examples, using social examples, using anecdotes. So don't be afraid to use those. I want this to be an argument paper, not a research paper. However, I have made the concession that I do want you to use a couple of quotes, just like King, uses a couple of quotes to help back up his own point.